In last Wednesday's video, I showed you how I go about creating luminosity masks in Photoshop. In today's video, I'm going to show you how I use those luminosity masks to blend together two images like these two. I hope you'll enjoy the video. If you do, and you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. Hi everyone, thanks for joining me. In today's video, I'm going to take these two exposures, which was from a photo shoot that I did about 3 years ago, and I'm going to show you how I can use luminosity masks to blend them together and create a single image with detail in both the highlights and the shadow areas where I want it. And I'll show you just how easy it can be to do that. In last Wednesday's video, I showed you how I go about creating those luminosity masks. If you haven't watched that video yet, you probably need to watch it before you watch this one. So I'll stick a link to that up there now, and it's also in the description for this video. These exposures were from a photo shoot that I did about 3 years ago. I was actually in a cave at the time, looking out towards the sunrise. So it's very dark in the cave, and obviously very bright out towards the rising sun, particularly as there were no clouds to soften the light or anything like that. Now at the time, I think I did about 5 exposures ranging from 1/5 of a second to about 10 seconds in order to make sure that I had all of the detail that I needed right the way through the luminosity range. I will admit it was one of the early shoots that I'd done with my Nikon D810, and I completely underestimated how good the dynamic range was on the camera, and I didn't need actually to shoot as many exposures as I did, but it's always better to shoot more exposures and not need them than the other way around. In fact, for the exercise that I'm doing today, I'm only going to use 2 exposures. This one, which was shot at a 5-second exposure, and this one, which was a 1/5 of a second exposure. So you can see there's a big difference in the exposure time between these 2 exposures. What I want to do is get an image that keeps detail in the shadow areas inside the cave, but also gives me some detail and tones and colours in the sky outside, and shows me the rising sun. But I also want to try to make it look as natural as possible as well. Let's get onto the computer and we'll see how we do it. Okay, so here are my 2 exposures in Photoshop. So they've been through Lightroom, and I've edited them as best I can to get, first of all, my inside of the cave showing the right amount of detail, and then I've got another one where you can see I've now got all the detail that I might want out in the sky, but the sort of shadow detail in the cave is completely missing, and no matter how much I boost it in Lightroom, that detail isn't coming back without adding a lot of noise. So that's why I need the 2 exposures to do it. I've got them opened as layers in Photoshop, and I've already been through and aligned the layers to make sure that when I do the blend, everything lines up as it should do. And now I need to create my luminosity masks. Now I don't have to go through all that rigmarole that I demonstrated, because as I suggested in the last video, what I've done is I've created an action, so I can just click on that and click on the play button, and it will take a few seconds, but it will create all of those luminosity masks for me, like that. Okay, so I've now got my luminosity masks all created here. As a matter of personal preference, I tend to like to have my sort of highlights scene on the top. So I'm just going to drag that top one down to the bottom, just change the order. So now my highlights scene is on the top with all the dark shadows. And then underneath that I've got my details in the rocks for all the blown highlights. And now it's just a case of picking the right luminosity mask to create the masking effect, to create the blend. So if I go down here, this is my most targeted highlights scene. And that actually at first glance looks ideal because it's giving a very, very nicely defined shape around just those highlight areas. But the problem with using a very refined mask like this is it can create some nasty edges. It can look unnatural. In fact, what I'll do, I'll just very quickly show you the problems. So I'll create a selection, go back to my RGB, go onto there, and if I create a mask, I'll go through that again in a second, but you can see on this one now, it just looks wrong. There's all these halos around the edges of the rock. It just doesn't look right. So let's undo all of that. And instead we'll find a channel that looks better. And I'm actually inclined to go either for the high 1 or the high 2. So if I look at the high 1, because this is a layer mask, or will become a layer mask, what we will get is white will reveal and black will conceal, and shades of grey will show through different amounts of the background. And I think this one might work. So in order to use it, I'm going to hold down the command key, which would be control on a PC, and click on it. And that's created a selection. I'm then going to click back on my RGB and click off the little eyepiece here on my luminosity mask. Go back onto my layers, and with my top image, top exposure selected, I'm just going to come down to the bottom here and click on add a layer mask, and that will use my selection to create a layer mask, and you can see it just there. And if I click Alt Command, you can actually see the layer mask. Now it still looks a bit unnatural, if I'm going to be honest. The contrasts around the edges look wrong, but I kind of expected that. And what I probably need to do is just soften this a little bit. So what I'm going to do, because what I don't want to do is now start messing around with this layer mask, because I've gone to a lot of effort to get the right layer mask. I don't want to do anything with it. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to make a group of just this top layer. And I can do that by hitting Command G or Control G on a PC. And I've now got a group, and on that group I can now put in another layer mask, which is there. And then if I take a brush, make it black, put the opacity at, I don't know, maybe around about 10-11%, something like that. Make sure it's a nice soft brush here, hardness at 0, nice and big. I'm just going to kind of brush in around some of these areas here, just to take some of that kind of harshness out. And that's actually looking quite nice. It looks much more natural. What I can also do then is also brush in maybe some of these areas here, just to return some of the light to it. In fact, I can probably bring my opacity up quite a bit, maybe sort of 30-odd%. Make the brush a little bit smaller. And if I just brush in here, you can see it's actually bringing back some of the brightness that may have been lost when I did the layer mask. Let's bring the opacity up a bit more. Yeah, you see it's bringing back some of the lost detail in there now, because I'm just brushing out some of that layer mask effect. And down here in the foreground here. Again, I want it to look natural. If this sort of inside the cave is too bright, it's not going to look natural. I may have softened the background a bit too much, so I'm going to flip my brush back to white, bring the opacity way down, maybe down about 6%, something like that. nice and big, and just brush a little bit more back in. Like that. What I may also want to do, again, while I've got a very low opacity brush, I'm going to make it small. I'm going to zoom in to 100%, and I'm just going to carefully kind of brush in around any of the edges that look a bit odd. I mean, there's going to be some harsh contrasts here. That's kind of the nature of the scene. But what I don't want is unpleasant halos, and most of it's worked okay. Maybe a little bit here that needs to be softened a bit on the edges. It's not softening the sharpness, it's just taking out a bit of the contrast around those edges, which can make it look harsh. What about this bit up here? Yeah, see, that bit's alright, it doesn't need anything doing to it. And that's it. Pretty easy to do. A lot easier than trying to do complicated selections and using the brush to tidy them up and all the rest of it. Really easy to do once you've done the work in the first place of just creating the layer masks and recording that creation as an action in Photoshop. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, please give it a like, share it on social media. Leave me a comment down below about what you think about this, and if you're new here and you've enjoyed this, don't forget to hit subscribe before you go. As always, I really appreciate you taking the time to watch, so thank you very much, and until the next video, bye.